The gas lamps of Whitechapel bled a sickly yellow light into the dense, swirling fog, their glow barely penetrating the thick grey curtain that embraced the district. It was late, past the hour when respectable folk were tucked into their beds, and the chill of an early autumn night bit deep into Inspector Alistair Finch's bones. He pulled his wool coat tighter, the damp air seeping through the fabric, settling into his lungs with each shallow breath. His footsteps echoed unervingly on the wet cobblestones of Needle Alley, a narrow, twisting passage notorious even by London standards. The alley's name was a grim jest. It was said that only the desperate or the truly lost found their way in, pricked by the city's sharp edges. Finch had been summoned by a cryptic, anonymous telegram, delivered by a breathless boy who had vanished into the night before a proper gratuity could be offered. The message, scrawled in an unsteady hand, read only, Needle Alley. Midnight. The silence arrives. Be swift, Inspector. Nonsensical, perhaps, but Finch had learned that in the sprawling, festering underbelly of London, nonsense often masked the most chilling truths. His intuition, a cynical beast honed by years of navigating the city's moral murk, prickled with a cold dread. As he rounded a particularly acute bend, the fog thinned momentarily, revealing a tableau that sent a shiver down his spine. Directly in the center of the alley, where the oppressive brick walls seemed to lean in conspiratorially, stood a lone, unremarkable wooden crate. It was of a sturdy build, designed for transport, yet it seemed oddly out of place, almost deliberate in its abandonment. Flanking it, like silent, unnatural guardians, were two figures. One was undeniably a man, tall and broad-shouldered, draped in a heavy, wide-brimmed hat that obscured his features and a greatcoat that swept to his ankles. His back was to Finch, a rigid, unwavering silhouette against the muted glow of a distant street lamp. The second figure was far more unsettling. Cloaked and hooded in heavy, dark fabric, their form was ambiguous, neither definitively male nor female, simply a presence of profound stillness. This enigmatic shadow stood slightly apart, closer to the alley wall, seemingly observing the scene with an unwavering intensity that Finch could feel even across the damp air. The atmosphere was thick, not just with fog, but with a palpable, unsettling tension. This was no ordinary delivery. This was a prelude. Finch swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. The fog seemed to amplify the inherent danger of the tableau. He took a measured breath, forcing his voice to remain steady and authoritative. "Good evening," he stated, his voice tight, echoing slightly off the damp brickwork. "Inspector Alistair Finch. I was told a meeting was expected." The hooded figure, the one that seemed carved from the shadows themselves, finally moved. It was a minimal motion, a slight turn of the head, but it conveyed immense, silent scrutiny. The voice that finally answered was a low, unnatural rasp, devoid of inflection, a sound that seemed to scrape against the cold air. It held an unsettling ambiguity, neither definitively male nor female, but something else entirely. "You are late, Inspector," the cloaked figure hissed. "A grave miscalculation of time. The delivery is complete." Finch's gaze flickered between the two figures and the simple wooden crate at their feet. "What is the delivery?" he demanded, taking another cautious step forward, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his service revolver, though he knew drawing it would likely precipitate disaster. "And who are you?" The figure in the greatcoat remained utterly silent, his back still partially turned, offering no clue to his identity. It was the raspy voice that answered, cryptic and chilling. "The crate," it said, the word drawn out like a curse, "is a lesson. And we are the collectors." Before Finch could process the chilling implication of that statement, the action began. The man in the greatcoat moved with a swift, brutal economy, a motion too practiced for a casual laborer. He reached down, grasped the wooden crate, and lifted it. The box was heavier than its size suggested, but the man handled it with surprising ease. He pivoted sharply, carrying his burden toward the dark, arched entrance of a building recessed between the tenement houses, a gaping maw of shadow. Simultaneously, the cloaked figure began to glide backward. Not running, but simply melting into the thickest part of the rolling fog, vanishing as completely as if the damp air had simply swallowed them whole. Finch shouted a command, a sharp, fruitless order to halt, but only the fading rumble of a carriage further down the main thoroughfare answered him. He saw the greatcoat and the crate disappear into the black archway. He sprinted the final few steps, reaching the precise spot where the crate had been moments before. All that remained on the slick, filthy cobblestones were two small, heavy iron weights, of the kind used in old shop scales, cold and silent under the gaslight's muted glow. Finch stood panting in the deserted alley, the cold metal of the two iron weights now resting heavy in his palm. The crate was gone, its carriers vanished, leaving behind only this cryptic pair of relics. He crouched down, examining the slick cobblestones where the box had rested. There was nothing, no drag marks, no splintered wood, no indentation deeper than a rainwater puddle. The departure had been clean, professional, and terrifyingly silent. His mind raced, attempting to classify the encounter. Was it a simple theft, interrupted? No, the cryptic dialogue, the lesson, the collectors, and the emphasis on silence, spoke of ritual, or perhaps a warning. The men hadn't behaved like common criminals. They had possessed a purposeful, almost ceremonial focus. Finch rose and stepped into the arched alcove where the man in the greatcoat had disappeared. It was a shallow, narrow entry to what felt like a disused warehouse or stable, dark and choked with dust. He drew his revolver and held the lantern high. A quick sweep revealed nothing, no back door, no escape route, just a solid brick wall at the rear of the shallow space. It was a blind spot, a dead end. The man and the heavy crate could not have simply evaporated. They must have been met by another accomplice, perhaps a covered cart, concealed just around the first corner of the alley, mere yards from where Finch himself had entered. Returning to the iron weights, he scrutinized them under the flickering lantern light. They were old, solid, and completely unadorned. They felt like a final punctuation mark to the scene. Why leave them? A payment? A calling card? He slipped them into his pocket. They felt oddly ominous against his thigh. Finch remained in Needle Alley until the first, pale suggestions of dawn began to dilute the fog. He had seen nothing, heard nothing more. The entire encounter, the whispers, the silhouettes, the black box, had been a fleeting, nightmarish vision that the London fog was already trying to erase. He was left with an empty stretch of wet brick and a chilling, certain knowledge that whatever had just been delivered was far more valuable, and far more dangerous, than any simple material object. The sheer lack of evidence was, in itself, the most profound piece of evidence. The disappearance of the crate became a frustrating bureaucratic knot. Finch's official report, detailing masked figures, a vanishing box, and two antique iron weights, was met with polite skepticism by Chief Inspector Graves, a man whose imagination extended no further than the bottom of a ledger. The incident was filed away as a probable hoax, a drunken prank targeting the police. Finch, however, could not shake the memory of the chilling silence and the raspy voice of the cloaked figure. 4 days later, a breakthrough arrived, not through police work, but by chance. The wooden crate was discovered resting innocently on the massive stone steps of the Royal Exchange, its presence a brazen insult to London's financial heart. A nervous beetle had found it just as the morning's commerce was beginning to stir. Finch rushed to the scene. The crate was, to his eye, identical to the one he had seen in Needle Alley. It was sturdy, made of dark, heavy oak, and bore no markings, shipping labels, or identifying features whatsoever. It felt strangely clean, having somehow avoided the grime and soot of the city. He carefully directed the removal of the lid. Inside, the box was utterly empty. Finch felt a surge of cold disappointment mixed with profound unease. He had expected a body, a ransom note, or some vile, inexplicable artifact. Instead, he found only a thin, pale silken lining tacked neatly to the interior walls. It smelled faintly of something metallic and sharp, like ozone, mixed with a perplexing sweetness, reminiscent of burnt sugar or an old apothecary's tonic. The material held no prints. The box offered no clues. It was a vessel designed specifically for the act of being empty. It was not a storage box, but a statement. A statement of loss. Finch realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the collectors had not delivered something to Needle Alley. They had removed something from the world, sealed it within this vessel, and then discarded the container as a final, mocking gesture. The lack of evidence was the evidence itself. The box's message was simple and absolute. Whatever had been contained within was now gone, its existence erased, and the crate, now open and abandoned in the center of commerce, was a boast of their terrible success. The silence had arrived, and it was complete. Dismissed from the official investigation, which Graves concluded was a curious but ultimately trivial matter of vagrancy, Finch found himself haunted by the empty box. The peculiar smell of ozone and burnt sugar seemed to cling to his coat, a phantom scent of the inexplicable. He spent the next fortnight deep within the musty confines of the London Metropolitan Archives, determined to find a historical echo of the collectors. His search was not for a gang of thieves, but for a peculiar philosophy of erasure. He pored over forgotten texts on obscure cults, esoteric societies, and the records of peculiar historical thefts. He focused on any mention of symbols, iron weights, cloaked figures in Whitechapel, and especially any references to silence or the deliberate destruction of knowledge. The work was tedious and discouraging. He found ancient references to the Eremites of the Silent Oath, a medieval sect rumored to destroy texts they deemed dangerous, but their methods involved fire, not empty boxes. He unearthed tales of 17th-century alchemists who used iron weights in strange purification rituals, but nothing suggesting a criminal enterprise. Every lead was tenuous, every connection an intellectual stretch. However, in a brittle, leather-bound volume detailing the forgotten histories of London's guilds, he stumbled upon a recurring motif. He noted several old accounts of missing apprentices, not those who ran away, but those who vanished suddenly after coming into possession of a new, unique skill or piece of information. In several of these 19th-century police reports, though buried under mundane details, the witnesses briefly mentioned seeing a man of shadow, or an unusually tall man in a wide-brimmed hat near the time of the disappearance. The pieces didn't fit into a perfect picture, but they formed a hazy outline. It suggested a group that had operated for decades, perhaps centuries, dedicated not to stealing gold, but to controlling a very specific kind of intangible wealth, knowledge, skill, or secrets. Finch realized the emptiness of the crate wasn't a failure to deliver. It was a symbol of the successful theft of something that shouldn't have been known, taken by an organization that saw themselves not as criminals, but as the self-appointed custodians of human ignorance. The true target was not a person, but their unique understanding. The empty box remained a cold case, but Finch's private obsession found gruesome validation 3 weeks later. The London papers were plastered with the news. Dr. Elias Thorne, one of Britain's most respected anatomists, had vanished. Thorne was renowned for his groundbreaking work on the neuroanatomy of memory. Specifically, the physical encoding of skill and knowledge in the brain's unique structure. Finch rushed to Thorne's quiet home in Bloomsbury, bypassing the local constables with the brusque authority of a man who already knew the ending of the tragedy. Thorne's wife, a frail woman in hysterics, could offer no explanation. The doctor had been working in his study late into the evening and was simply gone in the morning, leaving behind a half-finished cup of tea and an open medical journal. There was no forced entry, no struggle, and no note. Finch's eyes, however, were not on the general scene of domestic distress. They were on the front steps, beneath the ornate gas lamp that marked the entrance. He felt a sickening lurch of certainty when he spotted them. Resting against the polished brass door knocker, gleaming dully in the weak morning light, were 2 small, heavy iron weights. They were identical to the pair he had pocketed in Needle Alley, cold, solid, and completely unmarked. Finch knew then that the delivery he had witnessed was not the end of the collector's campaign, but the prelude. The empty box had symbolized a successful extraction, and now the iron weights were serving as a calling card, an arrogant declaration of intent. They were the signature of a terrifying organization that was not interested in material wealth, but in the eradication of unique, specific human knowledge. Dr. Thorne hadn't run away. He had been collected. The silence, Finch realized, was descending upon London one brilliant mind at a time. He carefully collected the weights, his hands trembling with a cold fury that Graves would never understand. Finch returned to Scotland Yard, the iron weights from Thorne's doorstep heavy in his pocket, a silent, damning witness. He presented his theory to Chief Inspector Graves, arguing that Thorne's unique expertise in neuroanatomy and memory made him a target directly related to the knowledge theft implied by the empty black box. Graves, a man whose worldview was bounded by clear motives, greed, passion, or revenge, listened with increasing impatience. Finch, you are drawing connections where there are none. A distinguished doctor vanishes. A delivery was made in an alley. And you link them by 2 old pieces of metal? It is coincidence. The man in the hat was likely a common thug, and the box, a stolen piece of luggage. The weights are identical, Chief, Finch insisted, placing the 2 pairs on Graves' immaculate desk. And the target is specific. They are not after money. They are after specialized human intellect. The empty crate symbolized the removal of something unique, and Dr. Thorne possessed exactly that kind of uniqueness. Graves waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense. Focus on finding the man, not chasing shadows and philosophy. Finch knew the official inquiry would drift toward the usual dead ends, checking passenger lists, questioning Thorne's known associates, and waiting for a ransom note that would never arrive. Yet, the intuition that had been honed in the suffocating alleys of London screamed at him. This was not a random crime, it was the start of a methodical campaign. The collectors were not merely stealing, they were performing an intellectual call. Finch resolved to work outside the official channels. He began poring over London's directories of academics, artists, and inventors, searching for other individuals whose work was so specialized, so cutting-edge, that it might be considered a threat or a unique prize. He began to profile their next victim, knowing with chilling certainty that the collectors were not done. The true darkness of the case lay not in who had been taken, but in who would be next to complete their pattern of silence. The case of the black box was now a race against an invisible, intellectual predator. Finch's fears were realized with sickening rapidity. Less than a fortnight after Dr. Thorne's disappearance, the city reported another vanishing act. The victim this time was Professor Arthur Pendleton, a celebrated, if eccentric, linguist whose passion lay in dead and forgotten languages, particularly the complex ciphers and scripts of ancient, non-European cultures. Pendleton had recently published a controversial paper proposing that a shared, primal linguistic root existed in several geographically isolated ancient scripts, a theoretical Rosetta Stone for all forgotten tongues. The scene at Pendleton's secluded Kensington residence was tragically familiar. Again, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and the pervasive sense that the occupant had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Finch arrived quickly, his authority as a detective who knew the case now momentarily overriding Graves' skepticism. He found the signature immediately. Resting on the professor's heavy mahogany writing desk, positioned neatly atop a scattering of fragile papyrus fragments, were 2 iron weights. They lay side by side, silent and cold, mocking the entire intellectual enterprise of the house. The specific nature of Pendleton's work immediately solidified Finch's theory. First, a man who understood the physical encoding of memory, Thorne. Now, a man who understood the deep, secret encoding of communication, Pendleton. The collectors were systematically targeting minds whose knowledge posed a unique threat to the concept of hidden truth. Finch examined the papyri. They were covered in strange, angular characters that he couldn't even begin to recognize. It was clear that Pendleton was close to some grand, unifying discovery. The black box had not been meant for just any information. It was designed for the erasure of information that could potentially unravel the hidden fabric of history, biology, or language. With 2 targets taken, the pattern was no longer a coincidence. It was a terrifying algorithm of intellectual purification. Finch felt a rising desperation. He was a man searching for a ghost in a fog, yet the ghost was leaving physical evidence that his superiors continued to ignore. Finch spent the next week immersed in the private lives of Dr. Thorne and Professor Pendleton. The official police investigation, focused on runaway suspects and false leads, yielded nothing. Finch, however, was hunting for the shadows, the anomalies, the things that didn't fit the mundane narrative. He interviewed the colleagues and research assistants of both men. With Thorne, the anatomist, the conversations revolved around his increasingly secretive research in the months before his vanishing. A nervous lab assistant confessed that Thorne had begun working exclusively behind locked doors, often late into the night, refusing to share his notes on what he cryptically referred to as the physical memory vault. The assistant recalled seeing a tall man in a dark, wide-brimmed hat lingering near the laboratory entrance on 2 separate evenings. He dismissed the man as a harmless eccentric. The interviews concerning Pendleton, the linguist, were equally unsettling. Pendleton's niece mentioned her uncle's sudden, intense fear of fire. He had meticulously duplicated his most recent work, separating the copies and hiding them in various locations, speaking often of a historical society that didn't want the source code found. Most chillingly, she recalled a strange, short exchange with a figure near the professor's garden gate, a person completely covered in dark fabric who asked her only one question: "Has the professor spoken of the Great Silence?" The pattern was undeniable. Both men were nearing a profound, unifying discovery that threatened to unmask hidden truths about human existence. Both had become paranoid and secretive. And both were tracked by the same 2 silhouettes: the rigid man in the greatcoat, and the spectral, cloaked figure. Finch realized the collectors weren't just stealing knowledge, they were harvesting it at the point of maximum yield, right before it could be publicly disclosed. They weren't reacting to the published work. They were acting on private, unseen progress, a terrible testament to their omnipresent surveillance. The iron weights weren't just a signature. They were a fee paid in terror for a service only the collectors could provide, the swift, absolute erasure of dangerous insight. The 3rd disappearance struck 3 weeks later, solidifying the pattern into a devastating, inescapable truth for Finch. The new target was Father Michael O'Connell, a prominent, though controversial, theologian attached to Westminster Cathedral. O'Connell was known for his radical textual criticism, focused on the apocryphal scriptures, those forgotten or excluded religious writings that offered alternate, often heretical, histories of faith. He was rumored to be compiling a definitive treatise that challenged the entire chronology of the Western Church. O'Connell was taken from his small, Spartan quarters attached to the cathedral. Like the others, there was no sign of struggle. The only deviation was a brief, almost invisible scorch mark on the wooden sill of his open window, coupled with a faint, lingering smell of ozone. The same scent Finch recalled from the empty black box. And, of course, the iron weights were found. They were not on the doorstep this time, but carefully placed on the closed cover of O'Connell's heavy, annotated Bible. Finch finally had his terrifying trinity: Thorne, the knowledge of the human body and memory; Pendleton, the knowledge of hidden human communication; and now O'Connell, the knowledge of hidden divine and historical narrative. The collectors were systematically erasing the key intellects capable of unifying human, linguistic, and spiritual knowledge. They weren't simply stealing secrets, they were preventing synthesis. The sheer arrogance of the act, committed right under the shadow of the cathedral's imposing edifice, only fueled Finch's resolve. He realized the nature of the lesson the hooded figure had spoken of. The lesson was that no truth was safe if it challenged the established order, or rather, the order that the collectors maintained. They were curators of ignorance, and their currency was silence. Finch's superiors had already dismissed the connection to the empty box. Now, with a priest missing, the case would be even more fiercely protected from his conspiracy theories. He was utterly alone in his pursuit of this invisible, intellectual terror. With the official investigation into Father O'Connell's disappearance stumbling over conflicting theories, Finch decided the key to breaking the case was not the missing men, but the iron weights they left behind. These artifacts were the collector's most consistent and most physical link to the world. Finch spent days with the small, cold pieces of metal, studying their patina, their balance, and their inherent symmetry. He visited several elderly foundrymen and scale makers in the older, industrial districts of London. Most dismissed the weights as common late Victorian shop scales, but one wizened old craftsman, named Mr. Silas, examined them with a peculiar interest. Mr. Silas pointed to a minute, almost invisible etching near the base of one weight. "See that, Inspector? It's not a common foundry mark. It's a private cipher, almost like a signature. This type of lead alloy casting. It's of the highest quality, very dense. It was likely commissioned. And the style, it dates back, not to the shops, but to the Guild of Silent Measurement. Finch had never heard of it. Mr. Silas explained that the guild was an obscure, now-defunct society from the late 17th century. They weren't merchants, but philosophers obsessed with true, uncorrupted value. They rejected government standards, believing that true worth could only be determined by a private, unchangeable standard. Their weights were crafted in secret to be used in rituals, not commerce. The weight itself isn't the point, Inspector, Silas rasped, tapping the metal. It's the perfect balance, the rejection of all outside influence. The silence you speak of? They wanted their secrets to weigh the same as truth itself. This revelation was profound. The weights weren't just a calling card, they were the philosophical emblem of the collectors. They represented a belief system dedicated to establishing a specific, uncorrupted standard of knowledge, and a commitment to removing any insight that tipped the scales of their perceived truth. Finch finally had a name, or at least a historical precursor, for the shadowy group, a lineage of individuals who saw themselves as the arbiters of intellectual balance. His pursuit was no longer just a police investigation, it was a conflict with a deep-rooted, esoteric ideology. Armed with the name Guild of Silent Measurement, Finch directed his archival search toward the esoteric and historical societies of London. He bypassed the public records and focused on the private collections of old, moneyed families, those who often held the darkest chapters of the city's history. In the dusty, forgotten ledger of a defunct literary club, he found a terrifying link. The ledger contained a list of members from the late 17th century. Alongside several notable philosophers and early scientists, he found references to a secretive subgroup known internally as the Curators of Inherent Value. Their meetings were always recorded cryptically, attended to the removal of the discordant note, or ensured the restoration of the primary silence. The entry that stopped Finch cold was dated 1693 and detailed a donation to the club, a detailed set of casting molds for the weights used by the Guild of Silent Measurement. The curators were not a religious cult, but a circle of rationalists and aristocrats who believed that certain kinds of dangerous, disruptive knowledge that threatened to overturn established hierarchies or challenge the natural order, should be surgically removed from the world. They saw themselves as the silent protectors of social stability, achieving it through intellectual censorship. The Guild's iron weights were their philosophical seal. Only the truth that held a perfect, predetermined balance was allowed to exist. This explained the systematic targeting of the three scholars. Thorne threatened the established understanding of the human soul. Pendleton threatened the established foundation of language and human history. O'Connell threatened the established divine truth. All three were sources of profound instability. Finch realized the collectors of 1891 were the direct, modern inheritors of the Curators of Inherent Value. They were a lineage, not a gang, and they were dedicated to maintaining an ancient lie. The black box was merely the modern ritual vessel for their centuries-old doctrine of erasure. They were not after the secrets, they were after the potential chaos the secrets would unleash. Finch followed the trail of the Curators of Inherent Value from the 17th century ledger to the present day, tracing the lineage of the names listed. Many had faded into obscurity, but one family name consistently reappeared in connection with the Guild's obscure properties and financial trusts: Blackwood. The same Blackwood family tragically known for the forgotten massacre of 1882, a case Finch vaguely recalled as an unsolved domestic horror that was quickly and thoroughly suppressed by the authorities. He found documents showing that the Blackwood family had been the primary custodians of the Guild's assets throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. More critically, their ancestral estate, a secluded manor on the outskirts of London, held a private, uncatalogued library known only to the family and their closest associates. Finch suspected this library was the true headquarters, the archive where the collected knowledge was kept, or destroyed. A key breakthrough came from an old, discarded property deed related to the Blackwood Manor. Hidden in the detailed covenants was a stipulation regarding a small, rarely used service entrance. It was to be kept perpetually clear for the transfer of bulky, unmarked cargo. The entrance was situated at the end of a long, overgrown lane, a lane that was eerily similar in description to the layout of Needle Alley. Finch felt a chill of definitive recognition. The man in the greatcoat, the carriage in the fog. It was a logistical operation designed to move sensitive, high-value material to a private estate. The Blackwood family, despite their public facade of dignified, if haunted, nobility, were the modern-day collectors. They were not simply preserving a doctrine, they were actively executing a centuries-old mandate of intellectual censorship, using their wealth and influence to operate with impunity. The chilling realization was that the Blackwood family murders of 1882 might not have been a forgotten tragedy, but an internal attempt to break the cycle, a violent, suppressed schism within the curators themselves. Finch now knew where the missing scholars, or at least the empty knowledge they once contained, were taken. He was no longer hunting ghosts, he was preparing to breach a noble, powerful conspiracy hidden in plain sight. Finch knew he couldn't simply raid the Blackwood manor. The family's wealth and political connections would bury him under legal proceedings before he reached the gate. He needed definitive proof and a direct confrontation. Recalling the collector's pattern, they acted only when knowledge was about to be made public. He conceived a dangerous gambit. He chose Professor Pendleton's work as his bait. Pendleton's research on the unifying root of ancient languages was still in manuscript form, but Finch possessed the key. He forged a short, compelling telegram addressed to the editor of the Royal Archaeological Society, detailing a fabricated, imminent public lecture, where the professor would finally reveal his findings, including a new cipher key that would unlock the Blackwood family's historical secrets. He ensured the telegram was sent from a public telegraph office known to be used by the Blackwoods' estate agents. That evening, Finch did not wait in the fog of a dingy alley. Instead, he positioned himself in a secluded, overgrown lane adjacent to the Blackwood property, the same lane he had identified on the old deed. He hid among the thick laurels, armed not just with his revolver, but with the chilling knowledge of their centuries-old mandate. The fog, as if on cue, began to roll in, thick and silent. At the appointed hour, he heard it, the soft, rhythmic clopping of hooves and the heavy roll of a covered carriage approaching slowly. Then, the figures emerged from the mist. The familiar man in the wide-brimmed hat stepped down, his silhouette instantly recognizable. Beside him, moving like a disturbance in the air itself, was the cloaked figure, the one who spoke in that raspy, unnatural voice. They were carrying a wooden crate, newly constructed but identical to the one found at the Royal Exchange. It was empty, of course, ready for its purpose. Finch's heart pounded against his ribs. He had successfully lured the collectors to the periphery of their own domain. This was the moment of truth. He would either disrupt the ancient system of silence, or he would become its final, most frustrating victim. Finch waited, every muscle taut, as the man in the greatcoat and the cloaked figure approached the section of the wall marked by the old deed. They exchanged no words, their movements a perfect, chilling synchronicity. The man in the hat placed the empty crate on the ground, and the cloaked figure produced a small, silver implement, using it to subtly manipulate the brickwork. A hidden door, perfectly disguised, swung inward with a faint, lubricated whisper. As the man bent to retrieve the box, Finch stepped out of the laurel shadows, his voice ringing with hard-won authority. "Halt! Inspector Finch. The collector's work ends tonight." The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The cloaked figure remained still, but the man in the greatcoat spun around. Finch raised his revolver, but the man didn't flee. Instead, he reached inside his coat and produced not a weapon, but a small, thick ledger. "You misunderstand our purpose, Inspector." The raspy voice of the cloaked figure finally cut through the silence. "We are not murderers. We are archivists." The man in the greatcoat opened the ledger to a marked page. It contained 3 names, meticulously transcribed: Thorne, Pendleton, O'Connell. Beside each name was a cryptic entry. The man in the hat spoke, his voice deep and weary, revealing a sense of profound, inherited duty. "They were not killed, Inspector. They were collected and protected." He explained that Dr. Thorne, Professor Pendleton, and Father O'Connell had all come too close to discovering the same unifying, explosive truth, a piece of knowledge that proved all human history, language, and spiritual belief was founded upon a single, deliberate forgery created centuries ago by the curators of inherent value, the Blackwood ancestors, to ensure social order. That knowledge would have collapsed civilization overnight, the hooded figure hissed. We don't steal knowledge, we quarantine it. We offered them a choice, silence in life, or chaos in death. The figures were revealed not as villains, but as the guardians of a terrible global secret. The empty box was the metaphor for the blank slate they offered their targets, a life in utter secrecy, sequestered in the Blackwood archives, dedicated to studying the forbidden truth without ever revealing it to the world. They had accepted the lesson. The iron weights were not a signature of murder, but the perfect balance of their agonizing choice, personal truth versus global stability. Finch stood there, the ledger in his hand, facing the most profound moral dilemma of his career. He could expose the truth and unleash global pandemonium, or he could accept the collector's terrifying, chilling mandate. Looking back at the impenetrable fog, he realized the true horror was not the crime, but the necessity of the silence. He watched the collectors slip back into the manor, and then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his gun. The ledger was burned that night, and the 3 vanishings were filed forever as unsolved cases. The black box had contained silence, and now, so did Inspector Alistair Finch.